Welcome, everyone. Welcome to CANIE Climate Action Week 2022. If this is not your first, or if this is your first session of the week, we're very happy to have you here. My name is Kelly Davis, and I am happy to welcome you to this session. Mitigating, reducing, rethinking. Sustainability is a key factor when planning business-related travel, featuring CANIE members Margherita Pasquini, Daniel Ponce-Taylor, and Noreen Lucy, who are really some of the best people to listen to about this topic, seeing as Margherita and Daniel played a really key role on a recent initiative out of the Europe chapter, Travel with CANIE. So we're very happy to have them presenting on this topic today to talk about what we as professionals can do when it comes to traveling sustainably for business. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. I want to share a little bit about CANIE in case this is your first time coming to one of our sessions. We are the Climate Action Network for International Educators. CANIE is a grassroots organization with a mission to mobilize and support the international education sector to act on climate. We are a nonprofit, which is entirely run by volunteers from all around the world, and we exist to do three things. First, collect and develop resources to help you take more action more quickly. Second, advocate for policy change behind the scenes. And third, create a platform for networking and to accelerate the sharing of good practice. None of this would be possible here at CANIE Climate Action Week without our generous sponsor, the University of Auckland. They are very proud sponsors of CANIE Climate Action Week 2022. And as New Zealand's leading university, they have a commitment to sustainability in their teaching, research, and operations. Auckland is the only university in the world to be ranked in the top 10 globally in both leading sustainability rankings, such as the QS World University Rankings on Sustainability, and Times Higher University Impact Rankings. And they were the first organization to sign up to our very own CANIE Accord. And you can find out more about their work towards the SDGs at the link that Ine just dropped in the chat for us. And now we're going to go ahead and switch over to a quick message from our sponsors.
Hello, I'm Professor Dawn Freshwater. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Auckland. I'm delighted that the University of Auckland is the United Nations Academic Impact Hub. We are honoured to lead this hub for 1,300 institutions across 130 countries.
I've always been very interested in climate change and to talk to other young students who are about my age and how our generation can make an impact in the world while climate change action doesn't have to start when I start my career. It can start now.
And now we're going to hand it over to our wonderful presenters, and I'm going to pass it off to Margherita Pasquini, and she'll take it away for the session. Again, mitigating, reducing, rethinking. Sustainability is a key factor when planning business-related travel. Thanks, Margherita.
Thanks, Kelly. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So that's our title. So today's session, we will address a hot topic for higher education. That is the connection between business-related travel and sustainability, and if and how the two things can be reconciled. So we'll be talking about the concept of mitigating, reducing. We'll share some data and numbers to better contextualize the conversation. And we will also share two examples that go towards that direction of mitigating, reducing, and rethinking. One, it's a group action. It's the Travel with CANIE initiative. And the other one is an individual action. And I'll be sharing my personal journey to CO2 reduction. But there's one term that I think it's missing in the title of this presentation, and I want to kind of quickly refer to it before we start. It's acknowledging. So we all need to acknowledge that we are contributing to the current climate crisis. And I want to read a quote from an article that I'll be sharing in the chat in a second. Quote, many of the staff members can be considered hypermobile elites who frequently travel around the world for networking, marketing, recruitment, research, and engagement, end of quote. And the article also points to the quote again, hypocrisy of such elites who tend to be aware of the climate crisis and the contribution of air travel to the crisis, yet remain largely entrenched in their high carbon air mobility practices. So it's us, they're talking about us, and I don't know about you, but to be called a hypocritical elite kind of hurts a lot. So acknowledgement, awareness, those are the tools to start this conversation today and our journey to reducing carbon emissions as an industry, as individuals, and as educators. So moving on to the goals for today, we have this one back, please. Yeah, these are the goals for today. So learn about the current climate crisis, connect the dots, how international higher education contributes to the climate crisis, and learn how to be an active actor in making business travel, professional development more sustainable. So on to you, Noreen.
Thank you so much, Margarita. So on the next slide, we see a picture of a bathtub. And this is really explaining mitigation. You know, what is mitigation exactly? It involves reducing the flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that can be either by reducing sources of these gases. So for example, the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heat or transport, or enhancing the carbon sinks that accumulate and store these gases, such as the oceans, forests and soil, peatlands, mangrove plantations, etc. Why is it so important to reduce our emissions? Why can't we just offset our carbon emissions and continue business as usual? Unfortunately, this is not possible. And this is where our bathtub analogy comes in. So if you think of the bath as our atmosphere containing our CO2 emissions, the water, before the Industrial Revolution, the amount of CO2 in the bath was stable at around 278 parts per million. And the CO2 produced by people and animals was soaked up by the trees and algae by photosynthesis, by our soil, our peatlands, and other carbon sinks. So it was steady. But since then, we've been producing far more CO2 than natural processes can absorb. And the bath has gotten fuller and fuller and fuller. Slowing down the tap does not reduce the water in the bath, it still increases it, just less quickly. During lockdown in 2020, we slowed the tap down, but only by 7%, which means we still added 93% of the previous year's emissions to the bath. Every gram of CO2 produced is more water added to the bath, and we will not have enough natural carbon sinks to keep the bath water stable. There's much hope pinned on technology to sequester emissions from the atmosphere, and technology does have a very important role to play, but this solution is not quite there yet, and we need to reduce emissions now. If the level keeps increasing in the bath, then the water overflows, and we risk exceeding our planetary boundaries. In the next slide, we see that we have a quick overview of the terms mitigation and adaptation. So we've already covered mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, is how we can adapt to inevitable climate change so we can protect ourselves and our communities. We cannot reverse some climate impacts from happening, and we're already seeing climate breakdown in many parts of the world, whether that's from fires, flooding, droughts, heat waves, or sea level rise. Adaptation is how we can compensate or adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. And in the next slide, we can see where there was a major win for climate change adaptation at COP27. The COP closed with a breakthrough agreement to provide loss and damage funding for vulnerable countries hit hard by climate disaster. And it's often the most vulnerable that have contributed the least to emissions. But in the next slide, however, we did not witness a great outcome for mitigation from COP27. Not included in the final text from the COP27 agreement were any indication of how emissions will peak before 2025, as the science tells us is necessary. There was no clear follow through on the phase down of coal, no clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels, and the text on energy was weakened in the final minutes of negotiation. So in the next slide, we can see that it's clear we have to reduce emissions. We cannot let the water in the bath rise any further. We need to halve our emissions by 2030. Scientists tell us we can still keep 1.5 alive if we mitigate and if we reduce our emissions. In the next slide, we see a mitigation hierarchy, and that sets out what is most favourable in how to mitigate. And it tells us We firstly need to avoid producing any new emissions where possible. The images here give us two examples. There are different terminologies, but they basically say the same thing. We must first avoid, then reduce, and only finally, or at the very least, resort to offsetting. The temptation, of course, is to skip to the steps lower in the hierarchy that may be easier or cheaper, but these will only, and at best, provide a temporary band-aid to these complex global challenges, and at worst, they will cannibalize any efforts for meaningful change. So on the next slide, we see emissions targets. How much do we need to reduce emissions? The IPCC states that emissions must peak by 2025 to limit global warming and reduce by 43% by 2030. The EU's own targets are to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and to become carbon neutral by 2050. And in the next slide, we can see that if we understand the importance of reducing emissions and we understand the consequences of not achieving our emissions goals, then why are emissions still increasing year on year? Climate change is a wicked problem, and what is needed is a systematic, multidisciplinary, transformative approach to provide solutions and a just transition for everyone. Of course, as people, we are concerned about climate change and biodiversity loss, but climate action can often seem an abstract concept and remote to many people's daily lives. There's often a disconnect between our emissions and our actions, and making the choice to reduce emissions is not necessarily the difficult part. What is difficult is the act of changing one's behaviours. We are creatures of habit, and that's what makes addressing climate change additionally challenging. Sometimes climate change is a distant problem, and people are generally motivated to address climate change when it affects them directly. But we shouldn't wait until the fire is at our door. We shouldn't wait until biodiversity collapses at our door. And we shouldn't wait until sea level rises at our door. And clearly, none of you would be here today if you didn't want to take action. Studies tell us that it takes just 25% of the population to enact real societal change. Achieving this potential, or becoming the first movers within that 25%, however, is a daunting challenge. It requires finding innovative ways of engaging individuals, our colleagues, our partner universities, our academics, and changing patterns that are ingrained in the routine ways we work. And in the next slide, we can see that this has particular impact in how we work in international education. It is a challenge. I might just go back to the last slide there and just let you dwell on the joys of traveling in case you've forgotten them. It is a challenge to break our habits and the way we work. Do we really need constant travel? Have we really reverted back to pre-pandemic travel? And is it because that's just how we always did it? Or is it because we believe that we have to travel because our competitors are traveling? And understandably, we also need to be in the room, or we need to be at that conference or that education fair, because if we don't, well, then we're not being competitive. But what if enough of us chose to work differently, or enough of us became the 25% needed to enact social change or to enact a new way of working? Do we understand our energy and fossil fuel usage when flying? To do this, an education and a behavioural change piece comes first. This is followed by engagement with our stakeholders, our international offices, our partners, and telling them this is how we're going to work. We'll not visit you every year. We might do that every second year. We won't see you at every conference. We might see you every third conference. It's just a different way of working. And there's also climate justice to consider. Just a small proportion of the global population take regular flights, giving them a disproportionately large carbon footprint. And in the next slide, we can take a look at the aviation industry in more detail. It accounts for about 5% of total global warming. And again, that might not seem very high, but we have to consider that aviation is the fastest growing source of energy related emissions in transport and is the most climate intensive mode of transport. We see that emissions from a single long haul flight can easily exceed the entire annual emissions of an average individual in many developing countries, and that is clearly a climate justice issue. And most importantly, the aviation sector is dominated by fossil fuel use. Electrification is not suitable for aviation, and there's no clear path to decarbonisation. at least up until 2025, but we need a solution now. And in the next slide, and I suppose with all of this in mind, and of course, we have within these CANIE sessions acknowledged many times before the role international education can play in emissions reductions. And I don't think any of us would deny that. We've looked at the importance of mitigation. We've acknowledged how difficult it is to change human behaviours and habits, but with the right support and guidance, and if enough of us are willing to reduce our emissions, then we can begin to see how this might be possible. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Daniel, and he's going to talk us through some examples.
Oh, fantastic. So thank you so much for that. So hopefully that has provided like a background. It's put like things in perspective of where we are and the importance of us considering our professional carbon footprint. Before moving to the next one, we'd like to put out a poll okay, so we'd like to know if you, either you personally or your institutions, your company, if you currently have a carbon budget. Is that something you consider, or even a carbon budget, more like a carbon reduction strategy for your business travel? Is that something you think about yourself? Is that something institutionally you discuss within your teams or within the whole institution? We'd like to know what your thoughts, what your answers are here before moving on to the next one. Fantastic. So it'd just be very interesting to see if currently we as a field, as professionals, if it's something that we consider, if it's something that we have thought about it, it's something that we discussed it. And clearly, as expected, the answer is no. It's something that we don't really think about it. Potentially more like think about it, but we don't act upon it. So what I'd like to do now is use the sort of all the context that we just heard from Noreen, and kind of, okay, what do we do? How do we act upon it? The first thing I think is, next slide, please, is again, acknowledging that we are part of the problem. We're also part of the solution. We're part of the problem. So I think the first thing is acknowledge it and commit. We're going to do something about it. In order to do something about it, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to be able to know what is the size of our contribution. So in this case, we need to calculate. Now, there's a lot of, I'm going to be talking a few slides about some technical terms just to make sure we're all on the same page. But I think there's a lot of words being thrown out there, left, right, and center, and I think it's important to clear them and sometimes make them more simple so everyone feels that we can be part of this solution. So if we move to the next one, we talk about we need to know where are we that we currently stand in. So we need to calculate. So whether we use super complex calculation softwares that are out there, or very simple, if you don't mind moving to the next one, please. Or very simple, or not so simple spreadsheets that I've just borrowed here kindly from Stephen. So thank you so much for these screenshots. But it doesn't really matter what we do in order to calculate where we are. And it could be just a very simple spreadsheet where we put, our transport from A to B using some of the existing calculations or calculators that are out there on different websites. So yeah, I mean, whether we use more simple software or not, it's important to quantify what is our current carbon usage, professional carbon usage, that is. The more detail we can have, obviously, the more we can actually go into our strategy. But I think the most important thing is just to get started. So I think that's, let's use the resources that are out there. Also, let's use our professional network. There's so many people here in this session today, but just at CANIE and out there that are already doing some amazing work. So let's just support each other in helping to make these calculations possible. The next slide, please, is once we've been able to calculate, we need to know what do we calculate, and I think that's important. We hear a lot about these scopes, and I think it can be quite a complex topic, but I think I like to just try to simplify because in order to calculate our emissions, we need to divide it into three scopes. But essentially, scope 1 and scope 2 are those emissions that are owned or controlled by us, by either us personally or our institutions, where scope 3 are consequence of activities of our institution, but they occur from sources not owned or controlled by us. So obviously those are the harder ones. They also tend to be the largest ones, so people tend to forget them. But it's important that we measure as much as possible and as detailed as possible all of them. So the next slide, please, is we hear about all these carbon reduction strategies. We hear about carbon neutrality, net zero. And I think people are very confused. And I just think it's all about semantics. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you call it. Ultimately, it's about our attitude towards carbon reduction. As Noreen said before, we have to acknowledge that offsetting or paying for something is not the solution, or at least it's not the full solution. We firstly need to acknowledge that we need to reduce. So whether we use what is be like a net zero radical approach, which is 90% reduction, like it's been defined by the science-based targets, or whether we use a more conventional carbon neutral approach, the point is that we need to actually, instead of just paying for something, we need to be firstly proactive at reducing as much as possible our emissions. I think that the attitude towards this problem of being proactive in solving it rather than just kind of finding the easy way out, I think that's very important in order for us to be part of the solution. Okay, going to the next one, please. So I think the first thing, as I said before, is firstly commit. Then we need to calculate, and then we need to reduce before moving to anything. How much can we reduce in our actions, in our professional actions? And as Noreen hinted there, do we need to go to all the conferences? Can we reduce some of our business travel? Can we mix some of our conferences with some of our professional partner visits? Can we ask them to also go to those locations? And can we travel to those professional site visits in a different way? Can we join 2 or 3 of them together? Once we've actually reduced as much as we can, we need to recalculate and then reduce again. And I think that's very important to have this cycle of just revisiting what we do and reducing as much as possible before we even consider our mitigation options, and where those are, and I'm not going to go into the details, whether offsetting or insetting, whatever you want to call them, but just mitigating. That's very important. The first is just reduce and reduce and review and reduce. And I think after that, it's very important that we share with our colleagues, we share with the wider network what we are doing in order for people and other colleagues and other institutions to realize that it is possible, with a change of perspective and a change of attitude, to actually be the drivers of the change. As Noreen put it, like, if we start making or driving the changes instead of waiting for the people to tell us, well, actually we'll reduce our business. No, why don't we tell our partners, okay, we're not going to go every year, we're going to go every, whatever decision. Everyone has to make that decision for the needs, but let's just make those decisions rather than wait for them to happen. Okay, so next one, please. Okay, so once we've decided that we're going to act and we're going to reduce, but one of the key aspects is, how do we travel? How does our professional travel? Noreen's already hinted at, and I'm not going to go into the details, but we know that air travel is the highest polluting or the highest emitter of all the different transports that we have. So at CANIE last year, this year we came up with the initiative called Travel with CANIE. It's something that started in Europe, because we acknowledge that in Europe we have a rail network that is easier and is more developed in other parts of the world. So we decided to test. We decided to see if us as professionals, we could change the way we travel to some professional events. In this case, we target 2 events. One of them was the Barcelona event, the EIA event, and the other one was the forum in Europe in Milan. So if you go to the next one, please. We had different goals from this initiative. First one was raise awareness around the missions associated with our own professional travel. I think it's very important, again, as Margarita stated at the beginning, to acknowledge our role. To reduce, so how many people could commit to this travel and actually reduce the CO2 emissions of us traveling to these conferences. Start creating a behavioral change within our field. And this is something that, it was an initial objective, and we were so pleased to see this, create a sense of community amongst all those adapting these low carbon options. And it was, some of those who chose to travel this manner in this session, and they can maybe kind of speak on the experience later on, but it was incredible, this part of it. So how did it go? So if you go to the next one. Well, actually, before that, kind of like, when we were trying to talk to people about it, about how that we could change the way we travel, we were like, okay, how can we promote? How can we say that is actually, what are the benefits of traveling by train, by ferry, or by other means of travel, not by plane? So we are, other than obviously the carbon, the CO2 emissions, there's many, fast, no security when you go to some of these transport. Normally you get from city center to city center, so you don't need to travel to a faraway airport. Luggage, you don't normally have as many restrictions. You can connect, you can move around a train, you can talk to people, you can just sit around, you can work for many hours, you can disconnect, you can enjoy the views. So you can use it as a way of slow travel, linked to also low carbon travel. So I think those concepts are very important. So moving swiftly, so we have time for some group discussions as well. Where's the? I think there's no. Move on to the next one, please. I think that was. There you go. So how did it go? So as I said, we had two events. The first one was in Barcelona. We managed to save 10.7 tons saved. And in the second one, going to Milan, we saved around 5.1 tons. Now that roughly equals around, about 16 tons in total, which is not exactly what it says on the bottom. I put 20 because that was the aim. But if you think about it, that's a lot. I mean, if you put about it, it's about 2 homes worth of energy in 1 year. There's obviously US standards. So that's, it's about 8,000 liters of gas consumed. So I think, it was a good experience. I think it was, it proved that it can happen. It proved that it's possible if in this case, we had a good rail network that we could use. I myself traveled in some of them by boat and train. And I've got to say, I had a fantastic time. I was able to really to work. I was able to enjoy the travel in a different manner. I was lucky that I'm able to take a bit more time, but I stopped in one of the cities, and I think it really changed the perspective. But I think ultimately, I think we proved that as an industry, as a field, we can actually start changing the patterns and change the behaviors of us traveling to these professional conferences. So now with that, I'm going to pass it on to Margarita, and she's going to go through her personal journey of reduction of CO2.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my personal journey and my story. So as you can see, this is me, and we're going to be staying here for like a couple of minutes, I think. So this is me, like happy traveler. I've been traveling since I was a child with a family. Then I studied abroad many times in different countries. And so when I got the job, as I guess most of us, where they were actually paying me for traveling, I was like, oh my God, you must be kidding, of course I want to have this job. And then I was in charge of, and still am in charge of study abroad promotion. So I was, traveling intensively for work. And when I say intensively, I really mean it. I mean, like being on the road for like 6 months, and we will see my traveling schedule in just a second. Then I got another job, a side job with more traveling, and it was like exciting, but my schedule was intensifying even more. And then during the pandemic, I attended a session where some people were talking about, the impact of our traveling as educators on climate change. And at the beginning, I was like very skeptical, and I was like, well, we are sensitive people, educated, very, we care about social causes. How is it even possible that we're causing such a huge, damage to the environment? And then I've been chasing some of the CANIE members, and Stephen knows it very well because I've been reaching out to him many times. And then when I was able to kind of understand better the point that actually, yeah, it was true that we are damaging the environment with all this traveling. I decided to join CANIE and to be, and this is about acknowledging again, you know, when I realized I was part of the problem, then I also wanted to be part of the solution, as Daniel said. So that was kind of my turning point. And obviously, since I was kind of by far kind of the most ignorant in the group, I relied a lot on people knowledge and experience, and I put my, commitment, time, enthusiasm, and those are kind of simple ingredients that everybody has. And we were able to launch, and the Travel with CANIE initiative that has been successful, that we've been working on for the entire year. So this is just to say that everyone can make an impact. And so now if we move on to my traveling schedule, this is my CO2 emissions in 2019. And I just took 2019 as an average year. So I don't know if you can see the numbers, but I calculated all the emissions and it's around 23 tons. And I used a very specific carbon calculator that it's atmosphere. And maybe we want to be sharing it in the chat in case you want to use it as well. And the reason why I use this is because obviously I was being suggested to use that because this calculator has the strongest and most solid documentation when it comes to measurements and keeping tracks of all the emissions. So, but 23 tons doesn't mean much if you don't compare it, if it's just a number. So we need to compare it with something. So I just put there some comparisons. So the per capita emissions in Ethiopia and annual car emissions. But what I really would like to focus on is the third little square, the green one, that says climate compatible annual emissions budget for one person, and is 1,500 kilos. And what does it mean? So I'm sure for many of you, like, this is pretty obvious and common knowledge, but let me share it for those of you who didn't have a clue, like me at the beginning of my journey. So there's this, let's put it this way, there's a specific number of CO2 emissions we can emit to kind of limit global warming, kind of going back to the image that Noreen shared with us at the very beginning. So it's kind of a cake of CO2 emissions. This is how I imagine, not a bath, but more of a cake of CO2 emissions. And we have a long party until 2050. And we want everyone to have a piece of a cake. So the cake is worth, let's say, 420 billion tons. And this is from the IPCC report. And since we're 8.8 billion people, it means that each of us can actually have a cake of 1.5 tons. And Margherita ate a cake of like 23 tons just with the flights one year. So I let this stick with you for a second because I think it's a lot to take in. I mean, I personally didn't sleep the first night I realized it, so I know it's a lot. So when they call us the elite, that's true. And all this has a lot to do with social justice. We're not going to be talking about social justice now. This is another chapter, but social justice is part of the equation when we talk about climate change. So now we can look at the next slide and see how I did this year. So I think I did much better. And you can see I cut down my flying emission by 64% with a reduction of 15 tons. And I traveled overseas only twice to the Forum Conference and NAFTA conferences. And what happened to the rest of the traveling? So how did I make that possible? So I was very intentional in like more virtual meetings, being more intentional and consistent with the online outreach. So not using the virtual meetings just like as kind of like a meeting before the in-person meeting, but really using more wisely the time, because the pandemic taught us how to do that. And then maximizing the time abroad, combining partner visit, intensifying the agenda. So basically working more when you're abroad. And also what you don't see in the chart is the low carbon traveling. So because like, since the chart is just about flying, I also went to 2 more conferences, the EIA and the Forum by train, both of them. So now I think my last slide is the next one. So I think the process I've gone through is acknowledging the problem, rethinking the strategy, mitigating and reducing. And what I've been doing here is primarily reducing. I haven't talked about mitigation at all. I have offset my flights, but it's not the main thing I've been thinking of. So reduction has been like kind of the main driver for me. And then also raising awareness and promoting sustainable traveling, because obviously you can work, you can cut your emissions, but you can also help other people realize what as a field we're doing. And if you wonder about the results, I want to tell you that we have a lot of students coming in, and the cutting the traveling piece didn't impact the results, which is obviously an important factor in the equation. So now this is my story, and now we would like to take some time for you to rethink your strategy, because we won't be able to tell you what to do. Obviously, you don't want us to tell you what to do, right? So you know your strategy, you know what your plans are, and so you know whether and how you can cut your CO2 emissions with reduction, mitigation. So now we're going to go for 10 minutes into breakout rooms, and you will be discussing these two main points. And if you don't want to go to breakout rooms, that's fine. Don't leave the session. You can stay in the main room with us, okay? I know sometimes breakout rooms are intimidating. You don't have to, okay? If you don't want to go, you come back to the main session. We're happy to have you. Just don't leave the session, okay? I hope you had a nice conversation in your group. And I don't know how many rooms we had, Debs, but maybe we can use a couple of minutes for a couple of groups to report back and share their main ideas, their exciting projects to cut their emissions or not. But Debs, do you want to call on like a couple of room? Because you know how many.
Oh, sure, yeah. There were 7 rooms, so I guess we could just start at room 7.
Yeah, is there any volunteer? If not, maybe Deb, would you be able to like call on somebody? Like you have the name somewhere or not really? Sorry for calling on you.
Room 7, I think, had Rebecca Johnson, Stella, Lauren, Anna, EJ Bryn.
I can jump in. So we talked about generally just like being a little bit more selective in which conferences one attends. So not going to every conference you could go to, but really thinking more critically about like which conference can I both get the most out of, but also give back to. And one faculty member in our group was saying that they decided to become more involved in the conferences that they attend. So actually like helping shape some of the content and making it into like what for them was a more fruitful experience in the end. We also talked about the importance. There was an on-site provider in our chat, and it was great. They have a program in Ireland where they actually have students do over the course of their program, they do an 8-hour carbon literacy program. So learning about their carbon emissions and impact. And then they also have the students visit a carbon offset project and actually engage in that project of tree planting. And I also have a faculty-led program that I work with that has a carbon offset project that they visit and learn about. And we were talking about how for students, incorporating not only like learning in, like an online module or a classroom, but also actually physically doing some sort of activity that puts them in touch and really impresses upon them the work that is involved in an offset can be really impactful in terms of long-term changing their mindset, as opposed to just in the moment feeling good that their program is offset or something like that.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's great. So any volunteer wants to share some thoughts about how they're going to be cutting their emissions or any idea?
I can jump in. I was in breakout room 5. A couple of us were talking about how we do a lot of institutional relations travel. So for instance, in my role, I probably travel the most out of everyone on my team. And so we were discussing looking at the history of the events that we attend. So things like study abroad fairs, for instance, and looking at which events are pretty crucial to get to that have, really high student attendance where our presence makes a big impact. And then what are events where maybe historically they're not well attended, you don't get many student interactions that necessarily lead to anything. So rather than traveling in person to those events, can we replace that physical presence with, a virtual interest session, which of course is much more feasible now that we've gone through the pandemic and schools and partners are more open to it. So trying to look at what is critical to get to, what is not, and sort of limiting from there, and then taking what is critical and finding ways to offset, again, not necessarily through literal offsets, but what can we do to diminish the carbon impact of the critical travel.
Love this, Sarah. Thank you so much. And if you have the chance to calculate it, just to have a sense of how much you're saving, I think it's kind of energizing for the team as well to see what kind of progresses we as a field are making. So I think I'm afraid we don't have time to listen to any other group. But Kelly, I think this is your final piece, right?
Yes, if Jake, you don't mind sharing the presentation again. Just some very quick words before we let you all go, but thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you and have this discussion, and I hope your breakout rooms were filled with interesting discussions as well and food for thought as you move forward. Hopefully some actionable items. Hopefully some of you are interested in getting involved with travel with CANIE. We also have a new Greening Conferences working group that's starting up with CANIE if you want to get involved with that. We're just getting things started, so it's definitely ripe for opportunity for anybody who wants to join. But in the meantime, if you can please provide feedback to us via the survey link that Ine has dropped or will drop in the chat very soon. We really appreciate your feedback on this session and any other sessions that you have attended or will attend, so that we can continue to make CANIE Climate Action Week even more successful and engaging and helpful for you. And I also want to say we're already planning CANIE Climate Action Week for April of 2023. So if you would like to get involved with that and you want to volunteer to help with either organizing it prior to the event happening, or you want to help kind of on the back end, as some of our volunteers are doing so now, you can sign up with the link that Ine will also be putting in the chat very soon. Jake, if you can move on to the next slide, please. We just want to remind you that there are sessions that are coming up for the rest of Climate Action Week. So we still have the CANIE Accord Promises, Turning Promises into Action, which is happening Wednesday, Thursday, I think primarily Wednesday, depending on which time zone you are in. And we also have our regional meetings happening. So I hope that you will sign up and register to attend those as well, and that we'll be seeing you soon. And I want to take a moment again to thank our sponsor and to also thank all of our volunteers for making this session happen today. We really couldn't do it without you, and I'm just so grateful to all of you for helping us make it happen.